123 check。好，我这边好了。 forum is organized by the Research Center for Humanities and Social Sciences at Nationalism University and the University's Innovation and Development Center of Sustainable Agriculture. To get this forum started, please join me in welcoming Director of the Research Center, distinguished Professor Chung for an opening remark.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the beautiful campus of Chung University to join this interesting and exciting event. The year 2020 will make a mark in human history. This is the year that the pandemic of COVID-19 connect people around the world. So as of September 17th, the reported case of COVID-19 reached over 30 million, and nearly a million people died of the disease. So we are just as the end of the pandemic is still beyond us, we have just begun to understand the scope and magnitude of the disease on the world. So the pandemic poses a challenge to our economic system and also our health system and our economy. But it also triggered crisis that bears political, social, and cultural implications. So how has the disease changed our world? How has it affected our lives? And how do we respond to the disease from critical point of view to the related cultural, social, and political issues? So we organized this forum to try to respond to the disease, the pandemic, critically. So it's our great honor to have among us 4 distinguished scholars from different disciplines to approach these issues from critical vantage point. So we welcome all the audience in person and also online. And also we have one speaker who is online who will join us from UC Davis. So I hope that you all enjoy the event and join the discussion later, and I wish the event a success. Thank you.
Without no further ado, we'll begin our first panel, which will be moderated by Professor Chung from National Taiwan Normal University.
Good morning, friends here and those online. Welcome to the first session. At this very critical time of the year, I know we have all become citizens of the COVID-19 emergent community. And therefore, social distancing has become a social code that we all have to follow. However, French comparative history model is proposing something different. It says social in the distance. In other words, no matter what, we should also keep social life, even though we might be physically distant from each other. So many thanks to the Research Center of Humanities and Social Sciences at Chung University to host this forum. So we can remain social and scholarly, energetic as much as we want to discuss and exchange ideas on important academic issues, such as the topic of COVID-19. First of all, I will introduce the 2 presenters, and then let them have their presentations. If we have some time left, we'll welcome a few questions, but I think we'll save the responses to the last session of today. Okay? So the first speaker, the first one is Professor Zhang Jiaru, Professor Jiaru Zhang. She's Professor of Modern Languages and Literatures at Berkeley College at City University of New York. Her research includes environmental humanities, especially with a strong commitment to Chinese critical animal studies
eco-criticism, and eco-cinema studies. She served as an executive council of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment. She has several publications. One of them is Global Imaginations of Ecological Communities, Chinese and Western Eco-Critical Praxis. That is also a workbook in China. And our second speaker is Professor Verskal. He is professor at the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at Chung University. His research includes literary criticism, eco-criticism, literature and ethics, literature and religion in the U.S. culture. He is a founding member of the European Association for the Study of Literature, Culture, and the Environment. He is now serving on the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment in Taiwan. He has many publications, such as Popular Vocology, on the literature and the cultural history of the modern environmental movement in the U.S., and many other books. You can also find many of his journal essays either on Google Scholar or ResearchGate. Okay, so now let's welcome our first speaker, Professor Zhang Jiayu.
Chung, Professor. And hi, everyone, good morning. Thanks for having me here to attend this COVID forum. And my talk is entitled Buddhist Pharmacon, Mimetic Problems and Solutions in Time of the Pan-Epidemic Anthropocene. So this is a new title. It's from my revised version. Okay, so before we start, let's take a look at some of the weird incidents. So during the COVID-19, you might see people fighting over toilet paper. And I was not able to buy toilet paper for almost 2 months. and you can see the whole aisle of toilet paper are gone. And also you see people burning these, very strange, they burn the cell phone towers. And so there's something going on here. There's a distinctive characteristic of this behavior is their infectiousness. A mimetic event, it shows that what constitutes community spread is not simply the virus, but also uncanny human contagious mimetic behaviors. So, scapegoating Asians, for example, that's one of the most notorious example. The spreading and circulation of certain attitudes, speech, action, and affects from one human to or community to the other. In this sense, both humanity and microbes are co-shaping force of the pandemic. And this above-mentioned COVID pathology is more than a meme that infects society. It is rather a mimetic problem that has deeper social, cultural, and psychological dimensions. So here's the starting points. In this talk, or in this paper, I want to analyze the mimetic phenomenon in times of pandemic crisis in the West. I will look at the phenomena such as scapegoating the cultural other for the pandemic or romanticization of the plague. So here are the questions. What to make of mimetic behaviors during the pandemic crisis? So I use Hene Zhiha's mimetic theory to interpret the widespread scapegoating phenomenon. And I also look at the Susan Sontag's theorization of metaphoric disease. And the second question I want to address is, what are solutions for scapegoating or mimetic rivalry or violence? So my main thesis here is, Mimetic behavior is a form of coping and a self-defense mechanism. It's a way to cope with social, psychological stress of pandemic. And scapegoating is used as a way to exculpate one's own liability or guilt, or it serves as an outlet to diffuse violence. And in the case of scapegoating, it tends to externalize and activate people tend to activate, in dealing with a crisis, this scapegoat mechanism. And number two is there's another mimetic phenomenon, is romanization of disease in the past. And this, I use this as an example, which tend to absorb the disease by idealizing it or turning it into a mimetic object of desire or fashion. As for the second question, how do we solve the problem? Some people propose to use other mimetic models, such as a Christian one, the post-jihadian, or capitalist. And I argue that those solutions are not adequate, and I will explain that later in this talk. And I would propose a non-mimetic solution, which is the Buddhist one. And I use the concept of no self or emptiness, shunyata or kong in Chinese, as pharmacons, which is poison medicine, to cure the mimetic illness in secular modernity. Okay, so now I'll start to read my paper. According to the literary and cultural theorist Paranoia, human mimetic impulse is linked to desire. That is to imitate other people's desire in order to make up. He believes that, that's a quote, man is a creature who does not know what to do, what to desire, and he turns to others in order to make up his mind. We desire what others desire because we imitate their desires. This form of desire gives rise to rivalristic competition. For example, competing for the same object, which eventually leads to a state of undifferentiation and accumulates in communal violence. So this is where scapegoat mechanism comes in. This type of mimetic violence can only be solved by sacrificing a marginalized individual or group as a recipient of blame for the chaos. Here, the scapegoat, or pharmakon, an ancient Greek word denoting the meaning of poison and medicine, who is identified as the troublemaker and must be excluded or punished as a form of social catharsis, so as to resume a new communal equilibrium. Such mechanism of violence management must be perceived unconsciously, and the victim cannot be regarded as innocent by the masses. So the very act of scapegoating must involve attributing guilt to others. Mimetic rivalry, violence, and scapegoat mechanism continue to prevail in modern times. During the COVID pandemic, we see various mimetic rivalry at work and had a real-life consequence on the outcome of the pandemic. For example, evangelical Christians in the US believe that they are exclusively favored by God, whereas those who get sick or those who are poor or powerless are clearly less favored. This is why evangelicals are certain that they won't get sick and won't have to shelter in place like everybody else and refuse to wear masks, since the worry over the pandemic is considered a conspiracy. A central element of their Calvinist the whole worldview is the idea that they are successful competitor for God's love. When the community turned out to be not immune to the disease, an explanation must be offered, either blaming the victims for the lack of faith or activating a scapegoat mechanism. As COVID-19 continued to unfold, it accelerates the disintegration of social unity, rationalizes populist tribalism, and empowers leaders such as Donald Trump to promote an image of the pandemic as foreign invasion and supercharge racial discrimination within his populist following. At the same time, the American far right has used the disease to stir anti-Chinese Asian sentiment and xenophobia as a way of deflecting its attention from the repeated failure of Trump's administration. Many cases of racial slurs and violence against Asians has occurred in the US. Cyberbullying of Asians is up by 900%, and Asians in the US has become targets of harassment, shaming, and even violent hate crimes. In New York City, for example, an acid fluid was poured onto an Asian woman. Given the widespread of mimetic rivalry, itself mostly unconscious, like a kind of infectious disease, it is worthwhile to consider its biological and neurological roots. So, for example, Franz Devold argues that the scapegoat mechanism is not just human; it's also rooted in primates. And as other scientists also discovered this thing in our brain is called neurons. So to argue that it's actually deeper in our in our biology and evolution. While the popular imagination focuses on questions of whom or what to blame, what is often forgotten concerning the collective mimetic obsession of scapegoating is the way in which the line of inquiry concerning who is to blame is historically framed. Historically, the idea of pandemic as metaphor has been weaponized against the cultural other. Robert Peckham, for example, provides an account of the way in which disease as cholera was Asianized by Western observers to frame the origin of the disease in Asia. In Western imagination, Asia has long been regarded as a source of contagion: Black Death, smallpox, and recently avian influenza. Peckham notes that Chinese identity in Western medical discourse during the 19th century was, quote-unquote, linked to the pestilence, with the country imagined as cradle of smallpox and the homeland of plague. From the 19th century, images of smallpox patients, which has been produced in China in the diagnosis and treatment of the disease, circulating in Europe, where they were taken as illustrative of China's backward characters. Peckham warns that such, quote, dominant historical association may be easily reactivated and inserted into contemporary context, unquote. And he's right. In COVID-19, we see Trump's populist demagogic instigation of the Chinese virus or Kung flu, linking germophobia with xenophobia. His rhetoric is not only a political diversion. On a deeper level, he reactivates a historical association of national stereotypes, which activates the image of the yellow pearl or the sick man of Asia. The blaming of China as part of the historical representation and geopolitical asymmetry, wherein the origin of infection are tracked to the global south and Asia and east. Xenophobia triggered by the large-scale global crisis like pandemic is also not new, given a long history of deep-seated xenophobia and racism. Here is anti-Chinese American in particular. Fear of disease becomes a powerful weapon against the ethnic other. The coronavirus is a convenient displaced outlet to unleash mimetic consciousness among a community. While cholera, a less formidable one, was externalized and become associated with the image of sick men of Asia, tuberculosis, one of the oldest and deadliest communicable disease in the world, was romanticized in the West. Susan Sontag's illness and metaphor provides insight into the way in which how the mimetic unconsciousness internalized the white plague by the 18th century Romantics as a way to cope with internal unwholesomeness. Consumption was co-opted into the formation of romantic identity to mark its own unique individuality. The romantic strategy of psychologically and socially coping with the deadly disease was to turn it into a fashion, one which is associated with status and artistic creativity. The yearning of being initiated into the cult of TB was founded in women who whitened their skin to imitate a consumptive appearance. Lord Byron even longed to die of TB so as to represent an interesting look. Under the veil of such glorification of the disease, what lies beneath is a profound anxiety about death in the West. Sontag writes, as dying has come to be regarded in advanced industrial societies as shameful and unnatural event, so that the disease, which is widely considered a synonym for death, has come to seem as shameful and something to deny. To avoid the mortification of having the same sort of disease that afflicted the poor or unclean foreigners, one self-defense mechanism is to block that sense of inferiority by inverting that negative affect, which is to glorify it, so as to allow a positive identification process to transpire, literally and symbolically, in the sense that it enables them to accept the disease while appealing to their vanity. Here, the romanization of TB, or turning TB into mimetic object of desire, inverted the perception of plague as we know it. The self-elevation and the scapegoating is nothing more than a form of denial meant to construct the West as both the subject and the victim of the disease. Both cultural trends are unconscious mechanisms to cope with and to shun liability and work unconsciously to cover one's own colonial complicity. Here, it is important to ask this disguise of victimhood or sublimation in Western subjectivity in actuality provides an alibi for another hidden fact. That is, the reality that European colonization of the Americas triggers the most destructive epidemic in history, killing an estimate of 90% of native population. The polarized, double-standard, mimetic cognition of the West continue until the present time. Whenever the disease originates in the West, there is a tendency to downplay its threat or not giving it wide coverage in Western mainstream media. But when it originated in non-Western countries, it immediately becomes labeled as a threat to the West. And the blaming of China has been part of this skewed historical representation and geopolitical asymmetry. So now I'm going to move on to the mimetic solution. For jihad, to break the cycle of violence against scapegoat, the solution is to demystify the mechanism by unveiling the innocent status of the scapegoat, as exemplified in the figure of Christ. A creation of new community emerged based on the imitation of Jesus' self-sacrificing love for God. Other post-jihadian solutions had also emerged at the present moment of COVID-19. For example, Nationalism proposed to replace the violent mimetic model with a healthy, life-affirming forms of mimetic communications, such as sympathy. Not to mention there's also other forms of solutions, such as the capitalist one, which claims that consumerism can help solve the problem of mimetic rivalry. These alternatives, however, more or less subscribes to the rationalist conviction that mimetic unconsciousness can be channeled in a desired direction, replacing bad ones with God's love, sympathy, or the newest model of iPhone. To me, this is not different from the romantic sublimation of mimetic force. Here, I use a couple of examples to show such mimetic solutions are problematic. The first one is the Black Lives Matter movement. The movement originally derived from an effort to rechannel mimetic bigotry in hopes to rectify racial injustice in the US. So, if your life matters, then it stands to reason that Black Lives Matter. As the movement unfolds, however, it was challenged by right-wing activists who mirror the racial justice protesters by labeling their own movement as Blue Lives Matter or pro-police movement, or it's called All Lives Matter, as if to indicate that they were the true racially awoken group. Eventually, these two opposing activist groups fell into mimetic rivalry and morphed into an undifferentiated state of doubling, this time over a moral higher ground. And despite the peaceful aspirations of the Black Lives Matter protesters, conflict with reactionary forces and erstwhile allies using the protest as an excuse to loot and to burn, which led to more violence and death. The second example of the failed effort at mimetic rechanneling is the so-called vaccine nationalism. Of countries competing to be the first one to produce COVID vaccine. This may or may not benefit global humanity, leaving poor nations behind. And as we already know, that in Donald Trump's withdrawal from the WHO in the midst of the pandemic with vaccine finally in sight, while the upsides are obvious, there are risks as well. The noble urge to help people becomes a mimetic battle for adulation, an ego-driven desire to be viewed as a superior country in terms of technology, wealth, or even beneficence. From these examples, we can see that well-intended mimetic solutions can easily descend back into rivalry and turn the mimetic ideal of moral higher ground into just another object of mimetic desire. To solve the prevalent problem of mimetic violence and scapegoating, I argue that mimetic solutions are not adequate, as they fail to dissolve the mimetic dualism. Or mimetic triangle, which perceive these units as separate rather than part of a holistic entity. From a Buddhist standpoint, the whole premise of mimetic rivalry is nothing but a false view of reality and selfhood. It originated from the delusory image of individuated self that create the fallacious subject-model-object divisions, such as the mimetic triangle. Those who subscribe to the illusory mimetic view would inevitably see relations in a dualistic and competing mode, which risks justifying exploitative hierarchy, inequality, and violence. In order to solve mimetic violence, one has yet to redress the modernist view of desacralization of nature, and ontological and epistemological intervention need to take place. The Jihadian school of mimetic demystification leave us in a state of stasis, which means stagnation. Not the state of ekastasis, is an ancient Greek word for ecstasy, which donates a sense of unification of self and other, or dissolving the boundary of the self that defines the non-Jihadian sacrality. The non-dualistic ontology of non-self or emptiness, which derive from such ecstatic experience, denies a sense of separate individualist existence. Buddhism regards the sense of separation, the source of mimetic rivalry, as a perceptual and epistemological mistake that can be corrected by experience such as meditation. Of course, other artistic forms can also have an effect on the unconscious, dissolving the mental habits. Here, mimetic way of thinking that creates illusion of a separation between self and other. A Buddhist non-mimetic pharmakon, which is an ancient Greek term denoting the meaning of poison and cure as well as scapegoat. So the Buddhist solution is by turning the no-self. So the Buddhist pharmakon is the one that turns to the idea of no-self and emptiness. It can serve as an alternative poisonous medicine that weakens the mimetic triangle in secular modernity. The idea of no-self or emptiness may be seen to threaten or kill or devalue all human relations when it actually makes compassion, which means co-suffering, by putting our identity at risk, hence possibly by freeing us from mimetic rivalry. In conclusion, in order to survive in the era of global pandemic and climate change, this ecstatic-based Buddhist pharmakon can help to form multicultural and multi-species alliances across the ethnic, animal, microbial lines. Thank you.
Thank you for Professor Chung's presentation. Let's continue with the second presentation and welcome Professor Hans Verskal.
I'm very glad that Jaro gave me license to change my title too. And I think actually our talks will probably make for a good pair, because I think my view contrasts many of the things that she just said. I should also say I don't have a PowerPoint. Well, what is my new title? Kind of not very original. Critical thinking in the time of COVID-19. Slightly, what's that? Okay, can I? If I shut the laptop, is that okay? No. Sort of like, I've been sort of thinking over my talk so much that I didn't have time to think about a new title. But I'm just going to call it critical thinking in the time of COVID-19, not the pandemic, because I think the more I thought about it, the more I came to the conclusion that the specific material properties of this virus really matter in order for understanding it. It's not just another disease, right? I mean, when we talk about it, we have this habit in the humanities to kind of use these actually quite loose categories, but COVID-19 is a virus that is very different from, for example, the Spanish flu, very different from like tuberculosis or AIDS. You know, I mean, of course, there are all diseases that can be turned into metaphors, but if we want to understand what's happening at the moment, we need to understand the specifics. In general, I have to say that I find it very difficult to muster the kind of self-confidence that is required in order to speak about the pandemic with any kind of, to speak about it at all, actually. People much smarter than me, for example, Giorgio Agamben, we are more about that in a moment, have done so, and they have generally ended up making fools of themselves. So I'm not really sure whether the kind of critical thinking that we in the humanities often take so much pride in is actually particularly helpful in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. I tend to flatter myself that I'm a person who thinks critically, who tries to form their own opinion by coolly appraising all the available information tries to resist hasty generalizations, resist the herd mentality, to quote Donald Trump. Looking back at the past 9 months, I don't think that these cognitive habits, even to the extent that they accurately describe me, have really put me at much of an advantage. I'm not even entirely sure what critical thinking really would mean exactly in our situation. If it means anything at all, though, it means thinking about thinking. Just as in Immanuel Kant's original critique of pure reason, critique tries to demarcate the boundary between that which can be known and that about which we can only speculate. In my view, the most striking thing about the pandemic, how it has played out, is how the virus has kept frustrating and embarrassing those who claim to know it and to know what should be done about it. Again and again, it proved wrong those who claim to have figured out how we should make sense of the events, how to tell a story about the virus which would follow a familiar plot line and confirm our beliefs. Again and again, the virus rubbed our noses in our own ignorance and forced us to revise and reappraise, to revise our appraisal of the situation. That's at least how I experienced the first couple of months of this year. Let me just reconstruct for you the mental gyrations I underwent during the first months of the pandemic. At the very outset, I read about the projected mortality rates of the new virus. They sounded low. Yes, higher than the ordinary seasonal flu, but come on, 0.5%. One person in 200 who catches it will die. That didn't sound particularly terrifying to me. So when Wuhan Feiyuan became pretty much the only thing the Taiwanese news channels were talking about, and of course we don't have television at home, but this was Chinese New Year, so we were stuck at my in-laws where the television was running all day. And I would kind of watch how this kind of completely consumed Taiwanese television. I initially dismissed this as hysteria. People in Taiwan are, from the standpoint of the average European, incredibly risk-averse, and they have a tendency to just forbid activities that are perceived as risky, rather than allowing people to take responsibility for their own actions. And this is something that, if you go to the beach, like everything is closed, there's like a tiny spot where you're supposed to, it's like, in general, like Taiwanese society, I think, tries to kind of keep people from taking risks. To me, the wall-to-wall media coverage of the outbreak in Wuhan and the worries that it induced in people seem to reflect this mindset. I suspected that all of this was vastly overblown. Even when the first video clips started to leak out of Wuhan, I remained skeptical. Yes, that's an emergency ward that's clearly over capacity. And the body bags in the street, that does look pretty bad. But it's just one image, or two, or three. But in any case, we shouldn't be too quick to generalize. So then, of course, the death of Dr. Li Wanliang became public, and the news of the lockdown in other Chinese cities started to be reported. The images changed. I particularly remember a haunting video clip filmed from the balcony of some high-rise building. The lighted windows of the neighboring buildings looked like so many candles at a vigil, and you could hear hundreds of voices howling their anger into the night. Okay, this is serious after all. But at this point, I still believe that the damage that COVID-19 was causing in China reflected above all the shortcomings of an authoritarian regime, which had at first tried to cover up the epidemic, and which was now, when denial was no longer possible, lurching to the opposite extreme, by imposing restrictions on its citizens that would be inconceivable and unacceptable in a free society. I also thought that these restrictions would probably be ineffective, because if people don't trust the government, they will try their best to evade these restrictions. I expected that open democratic societies would surely do much better at containing the virus. If people had access to trustworthy information, they would surely voluntarily act in ways that would make the kinds of coercive measures taken by the CCP unnecessary. Yeah, sorry. That's what I thought at the time. And then Italy went into lockdown. First a few communities in Lombardy and the Veneto, then all of the northern provinces, and on March 9th, the entire This was the point, of course, at which the public and governments in Europe finally started to take this seriously. And as an aside, allow me to defend my fellow Europeans against the criticism that of course, I probably have to defend myself too, against the charge that this was all Orientalism, right? Or the belief that disease is that's just something that happens in kind of dirty, far away, overpopulated places. Europe hasn't had a pandemic, like an epidemic of this scale, for 100 years, right? European countries and the US didn't have the benefit of the SARS scare in 2003. So they weren't ready, right? And I think partly the reason that Taiwan has been doing so well is because Taiwan knows that China, yes, actually is the source of many zoonotic diseases. And it's right next door. So, in any case, so confusingly for me, many governments in Europe took pretty much the same draconian measures that I had previously thought of as reflecting the authoritarian nature of the Chinese government. They didn't exactly lock up people in their own apartments, but for several weeks in most European countries, people were allowed to leave their homes only to shop for groceries and medicine. Of course, I also had to relinquish rather quickly the belief that democratic governments would be more effective at containing the virus. You all know how that played out. Even if one grants that China's numbers cannot be trusted, it is amply clear that it was more successful at protecting the lives of its citizens than most Western countries. Meanwhile, the abject failure of the US government to contain the spread of COVID-19 is plain for all to see. So as we speak, of course, the rate of new infections in Spain has climbed above its previous peak in March, and it's climbing very quickly in other European countries as well. Although thankfully this time the mortality rate isn't rising. It doesn't seem to be rising slowly. So what's the initial takeaway from all this? The pandemic is an exceedingly complex event, an event whose trajectory is influenced by so many interacting factors that predictions are very, very difficult. Almost all governments around the world have taken at least some emergency measures that have limited the exercise of basic civil liberties, such as freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, and freedom of expression. But they have done so to varying degrees at different stages of the process and with vastly varying and still uncertain success. Instituted in order to protect people's lives, the state of emergency has deprived countless people of their livelihoods and has unsurprisingly led to acrimonious debates over whether these measures are justified, proportionate, and successful, whether the harm they clearly inflicted was really outweighed by the benefits, or to quote Donald Trump again, I'm sorry, is the cure worse than the disease? And it's easy to make fun of that, but it's not a crazy question. I mean, not in any case. So the thing is that these questions could not be answered a priori. They cannot be answered just on the basis of normative considerations or cultural theory or political theory. How one answers these questions depends to a very large extent on the properties of the coronavirus as a biological agent. It depends on the precise ways in which the virus is transmitted, how long it persists on different types of surfaces at different temperatures, how it affects the bodies of different groups of people, whether they be old or young, male or female, overweight or malnourished, in the short and the longer term. Of course, these biological properties of the virus were not known when the pandemic began, and although scientists and doctors know a lot more now, there is still plenty of uncertainty. But once again, what is certain is that the pandemic created a situation in which governments all around the world, more or less simultaneously, suspended basic civil liberties in a manner that only a few months earlier would have seemed simply inconceivable. And this simultaneity is, of course, one of the things that makes this pandemic really unique and radically new in history. I mean, of course, we've had diseases that went around the whole planet, but never has this happened in a way that everybody knew that this is happening everywhere pretty much at the same time. Governments took these radical steps on the advice of scientific experts who kept revising their own assessments frequently contradicting their earlier recommendations. Most famously, of course, in the case of face masks. Right? During the early months, in Germany, the Robert Koch Institute, which is our version of the CDC, kept issuing statements that questioned the usefulness of face masks. Now, of course, wearing them has become mandatory in most public spaces. Similarly, in most other Western countries. Now, if ever there was a moment that called for critical thinking, this would seem to be it, right? Dealing with a crisis, that's what critical thinking is for. Just etymologically speaking, crisis and critique comes from the same root. Critical thinking, which doesn't simply take what the authorities tell us at face value, which insists that you need to think for yourself, to interrogate views that the unthinking majority of people accept as common sense. Say you live in Germany. The government suddenly brings public life to a halt and suspends basic constitutionally guaranteed rights of the citizens. They are no longer allowed to travel. They are forced to close their businesses, and they are required to cover their faces with pieces of cloth that are ugly, uncomfortable, and perhaps even unhealthy. The government says that these measures are necessary to protect people's lives. But this is the very same government that barely lifts a finger while millions of people around the world are starving, and that allows the sale of weapons which kill thousands of people every year. Are we going to believe that their actions are motivated by genuine concern for life? And what is the actual effect of these measures? They destroy the social relations that make life worth living in the first place. They isolate people, limiting the scope of their interactions to the bandwidth of the fiber optic cable. By instilling fear in people, they make it easier to manipulate them, to get them to acquiesce to whatever measures the government imposes. They massively exacerbate a trend which has been underway for a long time, namely the destruction of sensory experience, the alienation from our bodies, the bodies through which we participate in the world that is larger than us. Even more than before, we are confined with air-conditioned, artificially homogenized bubbles that weaken our connection to this larger ecological whole. And, I hope, note a slight tone of irony in my words, please. Just try to kind of get ahead of myself a little bit. And while we are huddling behind our screens, anxiously awaiting the next update about infection and mortality rates, and perhaps worrying about how to pay next month's rent, what is actually going on? After first deliberately shutting down most economic activity, governments have been handing out the largest financial aid packages since the economic crisis of 2008, giving billions of dollars to car makers and medical companies, while the central banks are flooding the economy with cheap credit so as to keep the stock market afloat. Who's benefiting from all this? Not us, obviously. The biggest windfall was reaped by the large companies that dominate the digital economy: Apple, Google, Facebook, and above all, Amazon. Jeff Bezos alone made $40 billion since the beginning of this year, bringing his personal fortune up to a staggering $160 billion. These companies are looking forward to the abolition of physical cash, which is, of course, a horrible vector of disease, and its complete replacement by digital payments, for which they would, of course, provide the infrastructure so that they can take a cut every time you make a purchase, right? While you and I are distracted by the catastrophic news on television, the super rich are focused on getting even richer. Governments that serve them, they are focused on perfecting the mechanisms of social surveillance and control that will allow them to nip and without any kind of resistance to this terrifying system. So, what are we to do? Well, one thing you might do is you might get online and organize other critically minded people and organize a large demonstration on the golf course outside of Stuttgart, where people can then gather with or without face masks and listen to speakers delivering arguments just like the ones that I just delivered to you. Speakers who exhort them to forge a path out of the, quote, digital financial prison into which those in power want to lead us, and to buy locally grown organic vegetables. Speakers who tell them that they need to resist Fremdbestimmung, heteronomy, and think, or like being determined by others, being controlled by others, and think through everything themselves, which is of course exactly what they did. The dystopian scenarios that I just sketched for you are liberally paraphrased and only slightly embellished mashup of the kinds of speeches that were delivered at the first big anti-corona demonstration in Germany. I don't know to what extent this has been an issue in the Chinese media, but in Germany this is upsetting a lot of people. You have a series of large demonstrations where people more or less aggressively flaunted the rules of social distancing, didn't wear masks, and of course questioned the conceived they questioned the common sense about the pandemic, right? Of course, these demonstrations are organized by a group that calls itself Querdenken, which might be translated as lateral thinking or thinking against the grain. Quer is, of course, the German cognate for queer, right? So it's like thinking critically, if you will, right? On August 29th, about 30,000 people gathered in Berlin to protest the government's measures to contain COVID-19. Among the demonstrators were also right-wing conspiracy theorists who at some point during the demonstration stormed up the staircase of the German parliament, the Reichstag, and waving the old imperial flag of Germany, prompting a lot of hand-wringing with politicians and journalists of the following days, who described these demonstrations as an attack on the democratic order, and promptly called for the suppression of similar events in the future. Needless to say, those who were sympathetic to the protests only saw this as further confirmation of the authoritarian tendencies of the current German government. Now, my point in kind of paraphrasing for you these views, the views that motivated these protesters, is obviously not to condone them. But I also don't think that dismissing them as crazy is particularly helpful either. Although there are, of course, plenty of people among them whose views should indeed be dismissed as just that. I mean, there are just anti-vaccination activists. There's QAnon is starting to spread in Germany as well, which is just beyond me, but anyhow. But still, ideologically, these protesters are all over the map. While the media, of course, highlighted the right-wing elements in the crowd, the views expressed by the speakers, whom I paraphrase for you, are actually strikingly similar to positions that are traditionally associated with left-wing politics. Which is why I also don't think that it's particularly helpful to dismiss out of hand their claim that they are thinking critically. They're doing something that looks very much like what we call critical thinking in the academy. Indeed, their arguments very often echo some of the most revered critical thinkers of the academic left. Like the first guy that I quoted you, who's threatening about our bodies being separated from the bigger ecological whole, and that was a guy who built himself as an entrepreneur, artist, and visionary. I mean, somebody gives himself those titles who ought to be suspicious already, I guess. But I mean, his views actually are, what he says there is very similar to what Giorgio Agamben said in February and March, when he published a series of articles about the invasion of a pandemic, right? It's also very similar to what Willy Speck, the famous German sociologist, says when he warns against government by experts. The second guy I was kind of paraphrasing for you is Ernst Boll, finance journalist, right? What he wrote about this is that's not what applies to disaster capitalism. It's the same basic argument. So while the remarkable animosity towards Angela Merkel's government and some of the slogans against the Lügentest, that's the German version of fake news, were expressing themselves in a language familiar from the refugee crisis of 2015 and had a distinctive right-wing vibe to them, racism and xenophobia did not really play a significant role in the speeches that I listened to. As a matter of fact, one of the MCs at the event was black, and he kept emphasizing how colorful and diverse the crowd was, and got lots of cheers. I think that it's quite important to take the ideologically confusing rotational pull that US politics exert on the global media landscape, it may seem that the debate over whether to open up or shut down was destined to line up neatly along familiar left-right lines or progressive conservative schemas. But that is not necessarily the case. There are also conservative governments such as Hungary and India, which have pushed very hard for lockdowns and which have combined this push with xenophobic propaganda. There can be no question that some governments are using the epidemic as a welcome opportunity to expand the capacities to surveil the total population. That's definitely true. But it's not true in many other places. On the other hand, there are left-wing responses to the crisis that resist such measures. Sweden, which imposed very few mandatory restrictions and relied almost exclusively on voluntary cooperation by the people, may be an outlier among countries with more liberal or left-leaning governments, but I see no compelling reason why the resistance to shutdowns might not be seen as a left-wing position. After all, shutdowns affect low-income people very harshly, while they are only a minor inconvenience for many people. So, another thing that really struck me when I was listening to the speeches is just how much emphasis they put on the loss of individual autonomy and the closely related problem, which the late German sociologist Ulrich Beck described as expropriation of the senses. The fact that, how much time do I have left? 1 minute! Okay, damn it. I thought it was not going to have enough. Okay, well, the problem that this is something that we cannot understand using our natural senses. We cannot rely on the evidence from our own eyes and ears to understand what's going on. I mean, as we all know, COVID-19 is a disease where a majority of the infected might never even know that they carry the virus, but which spreads so rapidly that by the time we begin to encounter visibly sick people, you can already expect that next day the healthcare system is going to collapse, right? That's very weird. That's very strange, right? So it's an object lesson in exponential growth, where a problem might seem insignificant until the day when it isn't, right? Which basically means you have to just listen to what the experts say. You have to trust them, because if you don't, you have to act at a time when the problem is not actually evident in any way to a lay person, right? This is actually also one thing that that's one of, probably I think, the most significant similarity between this problem and the problem of climate change, where we have exactly the same situation, that we have to rely on scientific experts to tell us that we have to take, potentially, if we really want to make problems, that we have to take measures that completely upend our way of life, in order to prevent something that isn't necessarily obvious. Right? Now, I have to say, even at this point, I don't personally know a single person that has had COVID, or that knows somebody who has COVID. I mean, when you talk to people, of course, you always talk about that. I don't know a single person, right? So, and of course, I mean, that's probably different for a Java who lives in New York, right? But I haven't had, you might say, sort of personal, first-hand evidence of it. For me, this is something that I'm familiar with only from the media. Of course, I believe that the scientists are getting this right, but I can't understand why the apparent mismatch between individual and public perception is profoundly disorienting and might raise questions. So the problem is, once again, that calibrating our response to the pandemic, we need to rely on medical and public health experts, and we need to learn to live with the paradox that thinking critically about the pandemic might sometimes require us to suspend our desire to think critically. We just have to shut up and say, do what the experts say, which is extremely dissatisfying. That's not how we like to think about ourselves. Like, we want to tell people what they are supposed to think about this. But I think, the attempts to do that so far have not been encouraging, so I will just stop here.
I know we are very inspired by the two presentations from the myamic to non-myamic dealing of the COVID-19 to a very interesting deconstruction of critical thinking to the encouragement of to think against the grain. I think we have a lot to think, but we have to move on. So now, please send your questions till the last session. Okay? So now let's welcome the second session. Okay, let's end the session right now. Thank you.
Take a 5 minutes break and come back here for the second panel.
I need to.
exciting panel. We are getting to the second panel. And ever since the beginning of the pandemic, we heard a lot about the comparison with Spanish flu. And before we knew it, we are making history. We are reaching almost the same magnitude of the Spanish flu that we just heard about before. So we are making history, and we are in the history. So therefore, that is why we cannot think really big yet, but we have to think. Now, our two presenters for this panel, I have the pleasure to introduce them to you. Our first presenter is Chung. He's the associate professor of the Department of History at the University of California, Davis. Howard has begun working on two new projects. One on the history of psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and mental health in specific Sinophone culture. And a second one on the intellectual legacy of Michel Foucault in the cognitive revolution. His book, awarded book, After Science, Medicine, and the Transformation of Sex in Modern China, received the 2019 International Convention of Asian Scholars Humanities Book Prize. It analyzes the history of sex change in China from the demise of castration in the late Qing era to the emergence of transsexuality in Cold War Taiwan. A new monograph, Transtopia in the Sinophone Pacific, is forthcoming from Columbia University Press. It proposes a new paradigm for doing transgender history in which geopolitics assumes central importance. He currently serves as the founding chair of the Society of Sinophone Studies. I would like let him to tell you about this topic, maybe it's changing. Our second presenter is Liu Wen. She's Assistant Research Fellow of Institute of Ethnology at Academia Sinica. Liu Wen is currently working on the prize-winning book project under contract with the University of Illinois Press, titled Assembling Asian American Psychological Technologies and Queer Subjectivities, where she draws from queer theory, affect, and diasporic postcolonial studies to examine how psychology as a scientific discipline has created Asian Americanness as a measurable biocultural population through a Eurocentric gaze. Her research has been published in internationally recognized journals such as Feminism and Psychology Subjectivity, American Quarterly, and Journal of Asian American Studies. Liu Wen is currently co-editing a special issue of Feminism and Decolonizing Psychology for the Journal of Feminism and Psychology. As an interdisciplinary scholar based in clinical social psychology, Liu Wen has also focused her research on the engagement between global social movements and psychological theories of racial, gender, and sexual subjectivities, particularly at the intersection of LGBTQ and diasporic Asian American experience. And I think their topics are related to sexuality, and this is a topic I think this is comparatively very touched in the whole discussion of COVID-19. So let's join me to welcome first presenter, Howard.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I want to begin by thanking the Research Center for Humanities and Social Science at Tokyo University for inviting speak on this forum. I'm really sorry not being able to be there physically to join you guys. Otherwise, it would have been these very festive events to meet both new friends and to catch up with old friends. But I'm really grateful that the center is willing to accommodate my request to make my presentation through web-based format. So without further ado, because time is precious, I'm going to delve right into my presentation. Okay. When I was first invited to speak on this forum, I had a very basic question in mind. To what extent can we compare and contrast the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s with the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020? On the surface, there are striking similarities. First, the viruses in both public health crises are deadly. That is, if they're left untreated, infections can lead to a fatal outcome. Second, both viruses are novel when they enter the human world. Medical scientists were caught off guard in both cases, and public health officials didn't really know what to do at first. In fact, as we know, HIV/AIDS cannot be cured, and there has yet to be a 100% effective vaccine for the new coronavirus. So due to their novelty, both HIV and COVID-19 elicit fear, panic, uncertainty, prejudice, and social chaos. Relatedly, a third similarity lies in the cultural politics of the pandemic. Both pandemics stigmatize certain groups of individuals to a far greater extent than others. So, for example, we know that in the early days, with the full-blown condition of AIDS, it was actually called the gay cancer because it was found most frequently among gay men living in cosmopolitan centers. In the case of COVID-19, Western media has racialized the virus by affiliating it with Asian people. As we know, the US president insists quite disgracefully on calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus. Such cultural associations contribute to the stereotyping of specific groups of people, gay men in the HIV crisis, and people of Chinese or Asian heritage in the COVID-19 crisis. The irony here, of course, is that neither HIV nor COVID-19 targets only one kind of sexuality or race, but these are powerful associations that continue to inform popular attitudes toward human difference. As other presenters on this forum has discussed, this is not the first time that China is scapegoated for spreading illness. Our parents' work draws our attention to the circulation of the belief that China was responsible for spreading smallpox in the 2nd century. And this culminated in the way that China borrowed the metaphor of segment of Asia from the Ottoman Empire by the 19th century in the post-Opium War era. Moreover, other historians, such as Harold Benedict, have shown that China was blamed for spreading the bubonic plague in the 19th century. Angela Liang has shown that China was blamed for spreading leprosy in 19th century China. And in the early 20th century, Diana Shaw has shown that Chinese America was blamed for spreading syphilis. Through and through, race and pathology are connected through the global circulation of ideas about Chinese culture, people, and identity, right? So the idea is that conceptions of Chinese culture are now wrapped in a specific pathological connotation. Whether we're talking about smallpox, bubonic plague, leprosy, syphilis, HIV, or COVID-19, we should be highly sensitive to the origins of these morally charged assertions. I think that a lot of the social anxiety comes from a concern about infection, and of course the direction is clear, from ill to healthy people. So this leads me to think more carefully about what the metaphor of illness are. In the case of HIV/AIDS, for example, we know that it's a virus that attacks an individual's autoimmune system. So the lens through which we comprehend how a person becomes infected is usually through the metaphors of war, battle, and defense. Much of the public anxiety and its underlying moral connotations center on whether an individual can fight the virus or defend oneself from a potential infection. What I'd like to do for the rest of my talk is to return to ground zero, to ruminate on how and why this notion of defense has come to shape our relationship to these deadly viruses. What equally interests me is the question of how this process assumes particular political salience for racial and sexual minorities. So I'll first go over a brief genealogy of a concept, the concept of the immune cell, how that became central to biomedical science. And in the second part of my talk, I'll focus on the experience of gay HIV patients living in Wuhan during the initial lockdown of the city to demonstrate my point, which is about why this notion of defense fails as a useful metaphor for society at large. I argue that a less antagonistic and more symbiotic conception of the self and non-self promises a critical mode of thinking in a time of pandemic. Okay, so let's start with history. Today, we tend to take for granted that our body is governed by the immune system, right? And by using the word govern, this is already saturated with political intent. According to the historian of science Ed Coleman, however, this has not always been the case. Scientific medicine at the end of the 19th century actually appropriated a long-time legal and political concept of immunity as if it were a natural fact. Okay? And this notion of immunity actually dates to Roman law, in which it referred to the exemption of certain individuals from political obligations or social responsibilities, such as tax exemption, legal capability, military service, so on and so forth. Key to this transference of immunity from law to biomedical realm is the discovery of phagocytes by the Russian scientist Ilya Nationalism in the 1880s. He conceived of cellular decomposition, right? When a foreign entity actually enters the cell, it decomposes. He thinks of that process as a protective process. So an organism can coexist with the environment in a defensive way. When we think about HIV or COVID-19, we have very much inherited this conception of immunity. Right? So when we think about how certain populations are vulnerable, we tend to think about their makeup as being less capable of defending themselves from the pathogen or foreign entity, or in this case, virus. Now, there is an additional twist to this genealogy, however. That is the connection between the cell and biomedical immunity really cemented in the mid-20th century. In 1949, the Australian virologist Frank Burnett published a seminal book called The Production of Antibodies. In this book, he introduces the idea of the immune cell. And this requires some discussion of antibodies. So antibodies, as we know them, are proteins produced by our body through a process of recognition. Right? First, they have to recognize the foreign substances are foreign, and then initiate a series of reactions to neutralize or destroy the foreign substance. So what Burnett is arguing is that, in this sense, the immune system not only identifies the foreign, but through that also defines the self. It's really interesting because what he's essentially arguing here is that the conception of the cell in this conceptualization of the immune system is a negative one, right? Because the cell is that which the immune system ignores. Okay. Later, immunologists will go on to find fault with Burnett's formulation. Burnet's notion of this unique self opens up the boundaries of self and non-self as a site of understanding and contestation in medical science. It kind of opens that up as a site of indeterminacy. And one of the points I'm trying to make here is that even within immune science, immunology, even though it can sometimes be reductive, rationalist, but it also at times carries potential for much more destabilizing and indeterminate notion of boundaries of self, so on and so forth. Burnet's work later led to a generation of scientists to really rethink this idea how the self relates to the non-self, or how the boundaries are not so stable. Later scientists came to see two major problems with Burnet's theory. For example, he doesn't actually allow room for many cases in which the immune system actually ignores foreign substances, or when someone ingests foreign substances, it's actually getting ignored by the immune system. The theory also doesn't acknowledge the many examples in which the host antibodies actually recognize cell constituents as actually normal parts of the cell body. So gradually over time, immunologists tend to see the boundaries of the cell and non-cell as not always clear-cut. Eventually, scientists made room for much more dynamic characterization of an organism. The immune cell is understood as allowing the foreign to be seen as it modifies the natural state of the cell. So the cell can be, and always has to be, an altered state. I think that's important because, of course, this metaphor works, this understanding works on the individual body level, but on the societal level, it also has a lot of implications. By the 1970s, immunologists endorsed the more information system model. They came to use the language of recognition, training, learning, and memory to describe the workings of the immune system. And this, what I'm saying here, is that it replaced Burnet's paradigm, in which the immune system is defined by the task of discriminating self from non-self. For the purpose of a forum, I wish to stress that this more dynamic conception of the immune system is more heuristically valuable than the defensive and discriminatory model upheld by previous scientists. As other critics such as Donald Haraway have argued, we find relevance in the potency of immunological debates precisely because the language and metaphors used in these debates both mimic and inform broader societal processes. So I'm putting on the PowerPoint here. This is a kind of a dichotomy chart that comes from Haraway's very seminal essay for the politics of postmodern bodies. And what she's saying is that these concepts on the right-hand column here constitutes the turning point of the 1980s. And replaces an earlier paradigm or earlier paradigms which are listed on the left-hand side here. So you go from representation to simulation, for example, and middle way down of the table, you see microbiology, tuberculosis evolving into new conceptions of immunology and AIDS. And so, of course, as anyone who has read Haraway before, reasoning is always can be quite diversifying. And I wouldn't suggest that his pathway from the left to right is a very singular and unitary pathway. But what's important is to think about how this is, of course, a very fundamentally historical process. Okay, so I think it's also probably time then, if we're to think about the context of COVID-19 in 2020, what would be an additional column of concepts that we might add to this? For example, ideas associated with social media, ideas associated with media activism, a lot of stuff are not captured in this chart. Okay, so to demonstrate what I mean and my point about the lacking, the trouble with effects, so to speak, I want to focus our attention on the experience of HIV patients living in Wuhan at the initial phase of the disease immediate problems for HIV patients who needed to acquire their antiretroviral medications. Remember, this was around the time of the Chinese New Year, so this made drug access difficult for both people who came from out of town, came back to Wuhan for the New Year's, or Wuhan residents who had traveled outside. Actually, mostly speaking, when HIV patients travel, they don't bring with them a whole month of medication. For privacy reasons and convenience reasons, normally what they do is to just bring a period of medication, like 1 to 3 days worth of medication. They only stay for 1 to 3 days, maybe a few days extras for emergency purposes. But the problem with lockdown was that it didn't have an termination date in sight. On top of that, people living in counties and villages also could not enter Wuhan City. As we know, maintaining access to daily medication is a matter of life and death for people infected with HIV. If taken on a daily basis, the medication helps to suppress the viral load to an undetectable state. It doesn't eradicate the virus completely, but it does inhibit viral replication. But if the patient skips a dose too frequently or doesn't conform to a strict regimen, the body can develop drug resistance, and the patient would then need to try out a different kind of drug, and as you can imagine, in a city like Wuhan, options can run out very quickly. So obviously when the government shut down the city, all of a sudden, vulnerable populations like gay HIV patients were the last thing on their mind. How did they overcome these obstacles? Some patients spent a lot of time trying to convince the traffic patrol to let them through some bridges or roads in order to reach the designated HIV treatment center in Wuhan. Some of them were successful, others were not. Some of them needed to lie about their health condition. Others found alternative ways to get help from friends or strangers. The number of HIV support staff at the Wuhan LGBT center increased from 2 to 8 in a day, and they were constantly bombarded with phone calls and messages seeking for help. By the end of January, each day, each support staff had to manage up to 40 or 50 cases. And even when some of the patients arrived at the Destiny Center in Jilin, they soon discovered that the HIV treatment center was actually unstaffed because all of the doctors and nurses had been transferred out to help with the COVID-19 pandemic. The HIV patients had to threaten to dial 110 as their last resort to get the attention of a physician doctor. One patient, for example, received his medication 6 hours before his last injection expired. In this unusual time, one of the most innovative networks that the Wuhan LGBT Center helped to facilitate is the drug borrowing program or initiative. So support groups were formed on WeChat to connect people from different parts of the regional network, and this helped people to identify the borrowers and lenders of the same medication. As you can imagine, there are risks involved, right? If one were to lend out the medication, it means one more day of not having medication themselves. But people in general were willing to help one another before the government stepped in. Finally, in addition to the issue of access to drugs, patients face one more challenge, and that is how to reveal their HIV status to their family. This difficulty became especially acute if someone becomes infected with both HIV and COVID-19. One HIV patient in Wuhan, for example, was suspected of having contracted the coronavirus. His family monitored him closely and would not let him leave his room. However, he only had 3 to 4 days of medication left. Being both gay and Chinese, this patient decided to come out to his parents for the second time because he needed to provide the necessary documentation in order to procure the medicine he needed. The only way to do that was for him to complain with his parents and reveal his HIV status. The Wuhan LGBT Center, of course, was able to help people to move through the bureaucracy, to fill out the forms, and even assist with their transplantation needs. But ultimately, the patient himself needed to make clear to his family why he needed to reach out to folks beyond his total family. I began with an interest in comparing the two pandemics, HIV and COVID-19. However, I'm now convinced that the intersections prove helpful for rethinking our relationships to our bodies, to the viruses, and other members of the society in which we live and share. We know that as an immunocompromised group, HIV-positive patients are particularly vulnerable in the current pandemic. Even before we reached the current pandemic, we already knew that some of the AIDS conditions are much more vulnerable to healthy individuals than the other way around. So what I'm saying is that the classical understanding of the immune cell as antagonistic to the non-self completely breaks down. Defense is not a useful metaphor for us to think through the social implications of a fatal pandemic. If we accept the modified immunological perspective, right, the perspective that considers the boundary between self and non-self as always porous, then we can move away from metaphors of defense, of war, and of illness. Instead, we might consider our health as a constant process of healing, in which we continue to reach a balanced state, in which foreignness and differences will be worked out and worked through together. And I should also add that this is not new, right? Even before the rise of experimental medicine in the 19th century, this whole idea of health as a balanced state is something that's shared by various medical institutions around the world. It would be a godsend for us if we can actually cure either HIV or COVID-19. But in a time of global crisis, new medicines are not the enemy, but the very agents of altering the state of being and normalcy. Barry, who's a staff at the Wuhan LGBT Center, revealed that the center had assisted with more than 500 cases by the end of January, and only about 8% ended with an adequate solution. We can only begin to imagine what happened to those 20% others within an already othered population. For example, the elderly, or people living in remote villages who have next to zero resources to get them any kind of support. A more collaborative, empathetic approach, as exemplified by the Drug Delivery Initiative, draws attention to the needs of the neediest members of our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chung, for his presentation. We will continue with our second presentation. Let's welcome Yowen from Antibodies.
Hi everyone, thanks again for Zhongxin Rense's invitation, Dr. Chung's invitation, and Dr. Wang's introduction. So my talk will actually, I think, echo a lot of the previous three talks Dr. Becker has deconstructing critical thinking, Dr. Chung's the limitic experiences, and also Dr. Zhang's comparing the HIV pandemic and COVID-19. So it's actually, I think, quite a nice pair. So the title of my talk today is Memes, Conspiracy, and Queer Paranoia, the Collective Affective Structure in the Pandemic. So my research generally situated in the intersections of critical psychology, affect theory, and also queer theory. So the pandemic becomes sort of really interesting, obviously horrific experiences, but for me to think about the affect of paranoia. So my talk today will be focusing on sort of the affective use and affective structure of paranoia. So pandemic paranoia. So I was actually still in New York around this time in March, and we know New York City was really the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak. And this is exactly how I felt at that time. You know, this little me from New Yorker was stocking up food. Everyone in the K-Tom's shop is hoarding rice. We bought a lot of toilet papers. We have a tiny apartment, so there's nowhere to store them. And I know a lot of the neighbors would even put masks on their dogs, right? So at that time, really, is this drive of affective paranoia. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know really what's going on. And so I think about pandemic really as a collective traumatic event that breathes and lives with and lives through paranoia. Right, and it really can't blame us that we have this kind of affect. On one hand, I mean, there are many different kinds of governmental policy. I was looking at plane tickets to come back to Taiwan at the time, and obviously, one night, people from the U.S. don't have to quarantine, and the next day, suddenly, people have to quarantine when they come back to Taiwan. And in New York as well, I remember when I was booking the tickets. All of a sudden, there was this rumor that New York is going to start a lockdown. I received a phone call from a very distant Facebook friend who never called me on my actual cell phone, right? And he called me and said, my auntie who's, in the top secret department in, U.S. defense or whatever, and he told me that New York is going to lock down tomorrow, so you better book a ticket today. So this is literally what happened, right? Everyone is, driving each other crazy. EVA flights was all sold out, within 2 weeks. So that, affective drive really comes from, again, not just carrying government policy. The government probably also doesn't know what they're doing. And also in the cross-national experiences, we come from one nation to another, from one state to another, there are also different kinds of policy, right? So there's a lot of suspicion, a lot of guesses, and also we know COVID-19, a lot of it is asymptomatic. So people are, wondering, is my neighbor, has COVID-19? Is it safe for me to go to the elevator? Is it safe for me to even throw the trash, right? So there's a lot of those aspects as well, in our daily routine. And in the broader geographical scale, there's also, the drive of the so-called new Cold War, right? A lot of the previous talks have talked about Donald Trump's, Chinese virus, the Kung flu and whatnot, really drives this kind of collective global kind of paranoid effect. And so I come back to really queer theories, and what really informed me during that time is Eve Sedgwick's work on paranoid reading. And she interviewed an AIDS activist in Manhattan who was really active, in ACT UP in the 1980s and 90s. And she says, how do we know what we don't know, right? How do we know that government is not lying to us? How do we know when it's going to end when we just don't know yet? And this is really the start of a question. This ideas about paranoia and critical thinking. And from the perspective of affective theory, I think it's important for us from a theoretical perspective not to value whether paranoia is good or bad. Different from traditional psychological science, we want to predict, we want to diagnose, we want to heal, so we want to give a pill to the paranoid psyche. From an affective theoretical point of view, we don't want to think about paranoia as whether good or bad, but we want to ask, what does it do, right? What are the affective capacity of paranoia? What kinds of action does it drive us to do? So this is, 1980s, around 1980s, when a lot of the AIDS activists, doing their dying protests in front of the FDA, which is the Food Drugs Administration. So you can see from that sign, one person was holding, question what you know, right? There's this sense of really activist paranoia to challenge what the government is telling us, because we have to think about during the 1980s, the US government was literally, right, spreading misinformation, telling people that, AIDS only happens when two men have having, perverse anal sex. So there wasn't transparent or even accurate information from the government. So it's understandable from a marginalized perspective. You do need to question the government. You do need to feel paranoid about what the government is telling you. So Eve Sedgwick talks about how the experiences of the AIDS pandemic and how queer theory and queer activism both arrive on that experiences creates a kind of interesting genre of knowledge of queer theory that in the knowledge production process, knowledge can be, actually in terms of any discipline, right, knowledge is a performative act. Right? There's a way we can think about the standard scientific discovery. We have introduction, literature review, we have the methods, very fancy methodology, analysis, and conclusion, right? That is a performative act. Well, in the humanities, we also have a way of presenting an argument to make it sound convincing, right? So knowledge is never just about the fact itself, but it's a style, right? A genre, a performance. And similarly, we can think about how paranoia is a driving way of designing this kind of genre. It's an affect, but it's also an analytical genre. And to say more specifically, Eve Sedgwick talks about how queer knowledge, the performativity of queer knowledge, comes from the post-structural Foucauldian way of thinking, or she calls it hermeneutics of suspicion, as a primary queer method. We always have to suspicion of power, any kind of power. Power is everywhere. Power is in the text. Power is even in the identity that we think of as positive, right? The creation of the gay identity, which queer theory is totally suspicious of. Because we think about any kind of creation as a way of re-articulating power. So the suspicion, the paranoia is in the structure, the text itself, and even in analysis. So oftentimes when we are creating queer analysis, we want to have all kinds of defense, right? We have to make sure our paper, there's no critique can penetrate the argument that we're arguing, right? So we're creating a very defensive, paranoid kind of writing style, particularly in queer theoretical production. And Eve Sedgwick talks about, well, we can't blend queer theories about that, right? Because it's coming from, again, the history of what AIDS pandemic has really informed a lot of the queer theory, right? That you can never be paranoid enough. This is a kind of marginalized subject defense. And you can't see this not only in terms of queer theoretical production, but in a lot of different kinds of writing that do in critical race theories, feminist critique, right? We often have to be very paranoid so that we know no power, no patriarchal, right, cis heteronormative power can penetrate our theoretical production. So, but in that way, Eve Sedgwick really trying to reflect on that practice. She said, well, paranoia really creates this preemptive response and critique to avoid any kind of harm, because we don't want to be lied again, we don't want to be cheap again. But sometimes this can ignore the possibility of more localized agency. So I often use this example of the marriage equality debate, I think particularly in the Taiwanese context. We know oftentimes in the left queer critique, we want to reject marriage as an institution, right? Because marriage itself is already patriarchal, it's about capitalism, private property, inheritance. There's no good can come from marriage institution. So why do queers want, getting married? So from a very left spectrum of queer critique, we have this kind of paranoia defense against any kind of state intervention, right? But in a way, can we ask now Taiwan, like in 2019, we have, gay marriage, right? And same-sex people can get the equal benefits like most straight couples do. I mean, it's limited, but most of them. Can we really say that nothing better has come out of that, right? Has it not really changed any queer person's living experiences at all? From a theoretical point of view, or from a political point of view, we can't universally reject that, right? Even though we understand marriage institution has its own limits. So Eve Sedgwick wants us to really reflect on our paranoid affect, right? And to rethink, there's actually more localized agency possible when we don't have to side in the far left spectrum. And oftentimes, and most importantly, sometimes the far left queer critique can end up in solutions that sound very neoliberal, right? If we don't want any state intervention, that means everyone is, only has to take care of themselves, right? So some people would actually argue that we don't want to come from a community level, which is one from one person in response to the state. So we don't want any intermediate level of community. So that would actually translate very similar to the right-wing agenda of neoliberalism. So in reading Paranoid Echo, this is a little bit messed up. But each center talks about how paranoia, has a few different kinds of theoretical style, right? It's anticipatory. You always think about the worst. It's reflexive and mimetic, right? It's only in response of a critique that it makes another critique. It's a strong theory, not in terms of it has a lot of strength, but in terms of that it seeks to have a universal solution to everything. It's a theory of negative affects, right? It drives from negative affects, and it places faith in exposure. That means its performative style is about exposing something that not yet has been known, right, to any other person. So, this is coming from her really famous paper on paranoid reading in the book of Touching Feelings. So I found this critique of paranoid queer theory quite helpful. So in terms of pandemic paranoia, there's a different way in terms of paranoia as creating social effects. So one very obvious phenomenon, I think Dr. Beckham has also talked about, is the conspiracy theory, right? It's actually wild how during the pandemic, there's so much different kinds of conspiracy that come out. And conspiracy is really interesting, this mirroring kind of a critical thinking or critical critique. It's suspicious of authority and power. It has a certain kind of narrative style, but focus on a single narrative to explain events in the world. So I remember during, I think, January in Taiwan, I started seeing a lot of the bad soup image, right, from social network, that a lot of people think that, well, there's Wuhan肺炎or there's COVID-19 because people in China drink bad soup a lot, right? I remember that very vividly because even in my liberal circle of friends, and people were circulating that. Even now, I think a lot of people will still believe that it's coming from this direct behavior of eating bats. But we know it's coming from different kind of transmission. It might be from bats, but it has to go through a different kind of animal. Right? So, and there's also different kinds of conspiracy about how COVID-19 is a bioweapon. And obviously this is perpetuated not only by the US government, right, thinking about how it's planted by a particular virus laboratory in Wuhan, but also by the Chinese government, right, thinking that a US soldier somehow planted a virus in China a while back to drive this kind of world pandemic. And another thing that was really interesting to me was the 5G conspiracy theory, and it's actually really popular in the UK. I found a statistical survey, at least a third of the UK citizen has believed in this kind of 5G conspiracy. So what they think is that the 5G network and the radiation penetrate your lung tissues, cause you to be more easily infected by COVID-19. Right, so there's a lot of the theories using this very complex way of explaining the world, but by just a single narrative. And another style about conspiracy is that it tends to divide, has a binaristic thinking between the evil elites and the good whistleblower. So I was listening to a lot of conspiracy podcasts in my research, and they often would talk about, this person, he has found out a particular email from a particular top secret government and blow out the whole thing. But when you think about it, this is actually not completely out of reality, because if you watch the Snowden phenomenon, right, that he found out that the US government was actually actively surveilling its citizens. So it's actually something that has happened in history. It's not completely that wild. So, the difference between conspiracy as a total myth and reality sometimes becomes quite blurry in our time. So the mentioning of conspiracy theory, in the US particularly, I think 60% of people have doubts about the 9/11 attacks. A lot of people think about it as a Jewish conspiracy. Some people think about it as some other type of corporation wanting to get money, etc., etc. So conspiracy is actually not so out there. A lot of people have some kind of beliefs in conspiracy. And conspiracy thinking, very interesting, particularly post-2008 financial crisis in the US. It has sort of engaged and mobilized with right-wing populism. And in a way, it's the enfranchisement of a lot of the workers, right, that think about the elite government can't solve their problems. So in that way, there's some momentum right there. So to think about this me, it's interesting, right? Me explaining to my grandchildren how a guy invests in China, lets the toilet paper shortage in the US. So, I mean, it's a really interesting single narrative, right, to explain a very, very complex world event, right? And conspiracies became tended to fall into that kind of narrative style. So I think also talked about this in previous talk. It has actual effects in the pandemic, right? There is the anti-vaxxers in the U.S. and also the anti-quarantine movements spreading out across the U.S. So right now, I think a lot of people think, even though the U.S. has rolled out a vaccine, at least a lot of people would probably reject taking a vaccine because they don't believe that's actually good for you. So I think the road to recovery is actually still quite long, but you can kind of see their argument, right? They're really asserting autonomy, and many think that COVID-19 still is only not much worse than flu, right? So that kind of thinking is still quite prominent in terms of coming from conspiracy and populist circle. So I want to talk about also really interestingly from one end to think about conspiracy and right-wing populism, but from another end, I also wanted to quote Agamben's writing. So a lot of the left critique, interestingly, they don't reject the claim by conspiracy theory that government is withholding information, such as in the ACT UP AIDS crisis and how it responds to the government. But oftentimes, left critique want us to return to a more structural, rational, and knowledge-based discussion, such as thinking about how COVID-19 is originated from global capitalism, the destruction of forests, right? Deforestation caused more interspecies, environment, things like that, and also the environmental crisis. So think about from that way, address the critique. But they have a similar paranoid tendency, right, of destructing the government. But sometimes it ends actually quite badly, right? Agamben, again, February 26th, he wrote this short essay and talked about how the government is overutilized state as exception to regulate the biopolitics of its population. And I was reading this, and again, I also saw, right, in March, all of a sudden, Italy becomes the first nation in Europe to lock down. So, you can see from the highlights area to say, really, the pandemic, the reaction from the government is something not too different from the normal flu that affects us every year. And this is quite blatant, that how the government is reacting to that. It is almost as if, with terrorism exhausted as a cost, with exceptional measures, the invention of an epidemic offered the ideal pretext for scaling them up beyond any limitation, right? So this is a kind of leftist paranoid thinking to think that any kind of state intervention is a means of biopolitical control. Right? So I think left critique we think about particularly this kind of, and often we go into an Orientalist discourse. So a lot of people debate with me would say, well, our European country, we can't do this kind of lockdown like authoritarian country can do, such as China. But in that discourses, both explicitly and implicitly, they would assume only in authoritarian states and not in the West can have a very heavy state control to control the virus. Right? So in that way, I think this kind of thinking is really not helpful for our time. And this is Rome in June 2nd, 2020. There was a big Orange Vest movement against the COVID-19. They were protesting against the government to say that how the pandemic does not exist, it's total bull, S-H-I-T. Right? So again, I think from Dr. Faye-Tai's talk, right, we can see how sometimes the critical thinking from the left will mirror to the result of the far-right populism, particularly this time. So, because I was trained as a psychologist, I love diagram, and so I don't know why it's kind of messed up, but we can think about how conspiracy from the left, it's actually from the right, but conspiracy, suspicious of power, tend to generalize non-factual critique, right, with a single narrative, a very sensational narrative, to make sense of the world. And critical theory, most of the time from the left, tend to withdraw from power. There's a critique, I think, from queer theory itself to say, we're critiquing so much that we're not building anything in a way that we become apolitical, right? We became inactive because anything is problematic, that there's nothing we can do. So critical theory tend to, in a way, withdraw from seizing power, and they tend to generate this preventive critique in order to shield themselves from another, right, cis-heteronormative patriarchal intervention. So we can see from conspiracy, or it tends to generate orientalist myths or right-wing populism and critical theory. Sometimes, most of the time, it's anti-structuralism, and sometimes, and we know queer theory itself, there's an anti-social trend, right? It could be anti-social in the way that you think about the only positive drive of queer is the death drive. And that's another debate, but that's a tendency, I think, queer theory all over. So coming from it, so what is the reparative process? So I'm asking, and I was reading obviously online a lot, and thinking about the circulation of memes. I think about memes is a really interesting genre of paranoid creation or paranoid reading. It's about transmitting information, but in the process of transmitting information, you assemble information, and not only with assembling information, you tend to humorize information. So I wanted to explore sort of the comparative practice in memes. So in people who analyze and study memes, we know that memes also come from a paranoid aspect about exposure. We know memes often has a sort of two-step structure. It's about revealing the second content so that people be, aha, I know what you're talking about, I think it's funny, right? So there's that exposing sort of aspect and style. And it's also about repetition, right? So memes has a certain format, but it can repeat itself, right? It has to follow the same format. But in the process of repeating it, it's also changing information. So I think about memes as a repetitive performative act that can actually repair the social when the time we're all stuck at home, right? So this is one of the memes I love the most. This means particularly about exposure. So taking the hood from this ghost to see who's really behind COVID-19. And Dada is Zoom, right? So it's obviously making fun of the way in which we are all integrating through online platform right now, but it's also kind of critiquing the national security suspicion or anxiety around Zoom, how it really takes our information. So it has built in some critique, but in a way humanizing it. And this other one is following the same format, you repeat the same genre, but you change the content a little bit. This is Charmaine, I don't know if folks know, but the US is the biggest toilet paper company, so it's kind of making fun of, well, who's behind coronavirus? It's actually corporates are sort of taking over, making advantage over people's misery, right? So it has a slight critique about capitalist corporation and how it's secret our life, but it's also humorizing them. And another one is slightly more serious. So this one is titled called Black Lives Matter. So it's about revealing what the US is really about. Let's see what the flag really means. And when it's revealed, it's a Confederate flag, right? So it's making really a leftist sort of nationalist critique against how, they think the white was taking over the US. And we see what the US really is. It's something that's governed by white races. So it has a way of making critiques, like in a way, humanizing it, making it circulable. And something about memes which I love is that memes that don't circulate can't survive, right? Memes only survive through transmitting and circulation. So it has to make sense to the people. So coming to my small conclusion, to think about queer reparative reading as a weak theory, and this is really coming from psychoanalysis and Melanie Klein, who talks about reparation comes from reintegrating the good and the bad object. There's a lot of infant mother argument I can't go into right now, but most of her point is about the paranoid position really is that we think about the bad things, we survive all the time, it doesn't go away, but the reparative position is to think about the bad thing will come in our life, but it's only a temporary, you only survive temporarily, it comes and goes, it comes and goes. So Cedric, sort of coming from Klein's theories about reparation, she said we need to develop a reparative reading practice, and she calls it a weak theory. A weak theory means we can reintegrate the social relation after the critique and reimagine alternate possibility. That we don't just end at the critique, we don't foreclose any possibility, but we think any kind of alternative possibility. So very quickly, I think about queer reparative reading to the genre of meme that examines, exposes, transmits, and reassembles pandemic experiences. I just want to give you one example of that so you can kind of see what I meant. And so I'm developing this paper. I think there's 3 types of way. One is rearticulate trauma. Another way is to re-identify democratic biopolitics and reshape geopolitics. But because of time, I only talk about rearticulate trauma. I think echoes with other presenters' talk. So in terms of rearticulating the trauma, we think about how a lot of means really reject the virus stigmatization and pathologization of a single population. So from the first talk, Dr. Chung talks about a lot of Asian Americans were facing discrimination, and this is from TikTok. And a lot of really young Asian Americans were, shooting videos and to make fun of themselves being seen as a virus, right? So you can see, can't read it from here, but on the right, the girl in the hood, she said, well, this is how you do when your Asian friend comes to your house. You're fully cured, you have all this alcoholic spread. So in that way, they're using this humor to say, well, your stigmatization of me is really messed up, but I'm not sort of taking it at an internalized level. I'm going to make some humors out of that. And also reiterate, the erasure and trivialization of the AIDS pandemic, right? To think in a comparison. So we have to know in the West, again, right, particularly in the US, they haven't experienced any kind of major pandemic. And the only reference that most people go back to is really the AIDS epidemic. So you can see from this means, this is from the very early of the pandemic, maybe like March or April, and they say when 900 people with coronavirus have been identified, and the whole world wants to wear surgical masks, but 13 million people have AIDS, but still nobody wants to wear a condom. Right? So it's sort of we articulate the trauma and the experiences from the AIDS pandemic and to say, well, we have trivialized a lot of illness because of stigmatization, and we don't take public health very seriously. And now we're seeing, a comeback. So we have to really think about these two together. And similarly, this one, which been circulating a lot, I think in May or June. So they really do a lot of comparison between face mask, condom, and genitalia. And this is very particularly to the US, I think, because again, I say COVID-19 and AIDS pandemic, there's a late. So they say, well, if you don't wear your mask when your nose out, it's like you're having your genital out, right? So they're kind of making that traumatic experience of AIDS, they use that as a chance of public health learning. So in terms of, I also want to talk about this case. In Hong Kong, we know, when the protests was starting last year, a lot of the protesters were wearing masks, but masks was actually banned by the Hong Kong government for a while. But now they're kind of using their body as virus carrying, right, to resist against the police. And it actually happened as a real event. There's a YouTube video, I don't have time, but there's a woman, she was pissed that, the Hong Kong police was spreading tear gas in her neighborhood, and so she coughed. She take her mask off and cough and say, I'm from Wuhan, you go away. But she's actually not from Wuhan. But she's using her body, the viral body, as really an active agent of protesting against police suppression. So in that way, we really see how this way of rearticulating the trauma can have actual, social effects. So lastly, queer weak theory, which developed from Cedric, reject the binaries of radical versus conservative, but emphasize the more small-scale, localized resistance, as we've seen from the previous examples. And the drive for analysis is pleasure-oriented, right? A me cannot be boring, right? A me has to be, has some humor in it that, call your attention so you can circulate. So rather than only paranoia-oriented kind of critical thinking. And so just quoted from her book, right? To read from a Ricardo's position is to surrender the knowings. I think that's a nice way to end, so thank you.
Thanks a lot to the two presenters to bring to us new perspectives and to diversify the discussion. But we will converge soon in the last session of the discussion to shoot out the questions that we withhold so long. And so thanks to Howard and Yowen.
We will take another 5 minutes break and come back for the last session of discussion. please take your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us till the last session. We will begin this session now, and this session will also be moderated by Professor Chung from National University. Professor Chung.
Okay, welcome back. I can sit and talk, right? Okay, thank you for joining us for the third session. After the 4 wonderful presentations, I think we are already enlightened and inspired by a lot of considerations about the issue of COVID-19. So in the last session, we'll welcome questions, comments for what has been presented today so far. Yes, please. Would you please identify yourself and then give your question or comment?
I'm Joe Li, Li Zhongxin, independent scholar. First of all, thank you for all the interesting talks, and I see some circulating issues in all the 4 talks, like races, matter of disease, or that kind of things. For me, interesting is the cases you talked about are most from foreign experiences, like Germany, the experience in the US, even in China, Wuhan. So, and I just came back from the United States and took the experience of the French situation in Taiwan. And I feel like it's totally like a parallel world in Taiwan. And you can see here, some people, I'm not blaming you, just a different experience, like not wearing masks and didn't get blamed. So, I'm just curious about, like, how would you see your theories or thinking about those experiences in foreign countries to reflect something to the Taiwanese audience here, to connect the different experience of the pandemic, the global pandemic in Taiwan. Thank you.
To Professor Verskal, right? Yes, so for the presentations today, first we move from the mimetic model and non-mimetic model to look at the issue of COVID-19. And then we move on to Professor Verska's consideration about or questioning of the critical thinking, and finally upholding the idea of critical thinking again. And then for the third presentation, we get to the issue comparing our attitude toward COVID-19 with our opinion about AIDS. And then to the last one, we get to the issue about the effect of paranoia and how to look at that from a clear, reparative perspective. And now, from your experience, since you have seen the situation here in Taiwan, and also your observation when you were in the States, so how will we be able to look at this issue from a cross-national, cross-cultural perspective, and maybe we'll be able to look at this from a more open-minded attitude toward that. So that is the first question we have. Any other questions? Maybe we can collect a few more and then let our presenters to respond. Okay, Professor Lin first, and then we get to the other one. Yes, please.
Okay, I'm Chung Lin from National Chung University, and thank you very much for all these very inspiring talks. Yeah, it's just after hearing your presentations, it reminds me of the COVID-19 pandemic seems to reminds me once more to the culture and science division. I mean that on the one hand we look at this COVID-19 phenomenon as a kind of probably ideological scapegoating mechanism, like as Professor Chung has proposes. But on the other hand, the COVID-19 seems also to be a very scientific problem, which we humanities people have problems theorizing, understanding. So it's Professor Hannah's talks reminds us of the possibility or impossibility of critical thinking in face of this cross-translational pandemic. And Dylan also talks about the rise of the paranoia or conspiracy theory, and seems to be also a kind of cognition, thinking or understanding, tries to reflect on this kind of COVID-19 thing. So seems to be so I'm kind of wondering your attitude toward do you think the COVID-19 is a kind of scientific, can we grasp this thing as a kind of scientific disease, or this is purely a kind of metaphoric thing? Okay, so actually I don't know how to exactly frame my question, but I mean that it seems to me that we humanities people, what's the role of the humanities people in face of this seems to be very scientific question? Okay, because all the public policies are mostly delivered or all these discourses are from the experts, medical and scientific experts, and what's the role of the humanities? Yeah, thank you.
I think you make your question very clear. Because yes, I think today's presentations remind us this antagonism between the science people and the humanities people. These two groups used to be kind of hostile to each other. They don't talk, they don't communicate, they seem to share different languages. So here, we as the humanities scholar, are we going to understand the COVID-19 issue from a scientific perspective or anything else? Culturally, metaphorically, or what? And is science a must in our dealing with this? Okay, let's get another question, maybe two more questions, and we'll get to some responses.
Hi, my name is Leo Xu. I'm from National Taiwan Sports University in Taichung. My question is maybe related to the last two speakers regarding how much do we know about the truth. I'm more interested in the truth, especially when I saw just heard that in Germany you had a protest the people really scare each other. So as a sports, as an athlete, the next year the Olympic Games will be in Tokyo. So it has been delayed for 1 year, and then now they are creating the scenario that no matter what, they would go ahead. So there's two side truths. One, actually all in Japan, the scholar mentioned that the game should go ahead, but and the official people also say the game should go ahead, but some say no, it's kind of scary. So the point is, we always think, do you think perhaps we don't know so much about the scientific truth? Because that reminds me of this year when this pandemic outbreak started in the USA, and there's a kind of saying actually the death rate of the flu in America actually is much higher than the death rate of related to COVID-19. So the point is, do we scare ourselves? How do you say that? Overly, too much. We have a saying, people scare people, actually, which is not necessary. Especially in Taiwan, the death rate compared with other countries. Of course, you might say we have a better control, but perhaps in a way normally we have a better hygiene lifestyle habits. We do prevent this kind of possibility of death rate. But if you don't care about yourself, especially the winter time, I remember also in Taiwan, a lot of death rate during the winter time because of the flu. So in compare with the death rate of the flu in America and the death rate of the COVID-19, I find it's very interesting. So how much do we know the truth? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you for the third question. Let's have two more questions, and then we'll get to responses from the presenters. One here, the gentleman in black, and then the scholar next to you. And then after the responses, we get to the second round of questions.
I got the microphone. My name is Gary Shi. I'm from the Department of Psychology at National Chung University. Even though I'm a psychologist, I'm not a typical social cultural psychologist or cognitive neuroscience. I have been observing, actually, I was trying to, find some of the comment that other colleagues made. It's very interesting to sort of hear some cross-cultural comparison between, say, the case in the US and the case in Taiwan. And as a psychologist, this is not a really professional sort of comment, but you can think there's a couple of dimensions that may lead to this huge contrast of how we feel or respond to COVID-19 situation. First thing is Taiwan apparently very successful in terms of taking a public health strategy rather than pure medical. The U.S. basically just giving up. When you look at Donald Trump, right, he's just shooting for a vaccine. So that's not a public health strategy. Well, hopefully it's a medical strategy. The other thing is a more cultural dimension where Taiwan is still, as a young democracy, is still holding a strong collectivist tendency, where they respect the official or expert in public health domain. So when they say something, in the public, we tend to believe. But as an individualist country, the U.S. does not do that. Generally, or European countries, many of the citizens, young people, they don't do that. Another very important experience that we keep in mind is that Taiwan has suffered from SARS in 2012, 13, and 14. That scared the hell out of us. Even though
Thank you for bringing us to see the different levels of population and democracy. Okay, next. Yes. Yes.
My name is Sarah Neswell Mingsuguo. I'm from Suzhou University, University. And I just wanted to start by saying thank you to all of the attendees. It was really interesting listening to you. But I particularly wanted to say thank you to Viola, because I found that it was really uplifting. The end of your talk, you had so many interesting things to say, but at the end of your talk, I found it very uplifting to see how you took the queer theory and kind of turned all of that negativity on its head to give us an opportunity to pull something positive out of it. And so I found that really, really uplifting, and I found that was kind of interesting also to see your last phrase kind of that kind of very, very closely echoed Professor Verskaler's comment on surrendering. You put surrendering the knowing, which is, you were both talking pretty much about the same thing, I think, which is interesting. So I just wanted to say thank you about that. I think we're all looking at these issues, and we're talking about the disease in terms of its biology, right? In terms of biology and the technical side, and how most of us, without a medical background, if we don't have enough medical background, certainly we might feel that we don't have the means to properly grasp these issues. And of course, even the medical people are still continuing to try to understand what the illness is doing and how it's developing. So this is certainly a challenging question. But we've been divided, what I've heard is a division, at least on 3 levels, maybe on more if other people were listening more carefully. You were dividing the biology of it, the social aspect of the disease, and then the theoretical, as if these 3 were somehow disconnected. But of course, all of these have to necessarily be embodied. I mean, we don't have a society without bodies in the world walking around and doing things, right? And we don't really have a society when we don't have people thinking and doing and having beliefs. So those 3 aspects, I feel, should be somehow embraced and embodied together. So I'm not sure who exactly would like to respond to that, but I just wanted to throw that concept out there and let you come back to me with whatever interesting and amazing ideas you can give us.
Thank you for the questions. So now we'll get to the responses. After that, we'll get to the second round of questions. Now, I think our presenters can choose whatever question they want to respond to. They have the liberty of doing that.
Thank you for all the questions, and I'll just try to answer some of them. The first one, in terms of the cross-cultural comparison of COVID-19 from our own methodological approaches, and I think that you can see very clearly the magic rivalry between Taiwan and China in terms of the mask diplomacy. You know, Taiwan is trying very hard to convince the world that Taiwan is actually had a better quality of mask, and we represent the opposite, the complete opposite of Chinese, the Communist Party, and you can see that play out, and whereas the U.S. has their own the China-U.S. sort of becomes competing, and it is very similar to what's happening in terms of the vaccine nationalism that I was talking about. So this is something that I observed that if I can apply. And in terms of scapegoat mechanism, in China they have their own scapegoats. They scapegoat African Americans in Guangzhou, for example. And as to in Taiwan, actually I don't know that much if can I even say that we also say go China? Would that be too politically incorrect to say that in here? So this is a very sensitive issue, so I'll leave it there. And I'd like to respond to Professor Lin Jianguang's question about the role that humanity plays. I believe that the term environmental problems or climate change problem, even the COVID problem, is not their problem, it's our problem. We created those issues, all those problems. So in a sense, Anthropocene crisis in general is a humanistic crisis, is a humanist crisis. So yes, science plays a role in terms of telling us the truth or telling us what to do, right? Follow the DMC guideline. It has a role, but it's logistic, it's pragmatic. But it does not play an ontological role. In the end, we still have to reflect very fundamentally the way we relate to nature, the way we treat nature, treat others, the human other or non-human other. And this is probably the most, sort of a prequel to climate change, right? If we see how we deal with COVID-19, then probably we'll get a better idea of how we deal with the future crisis. And I think that even when Nana said that, probably we shouldn't do critical thinking as things like that, it itself is a reflexive critical thinking, right? So we can never escape from humanist reflection. We have to always come back and do more. That's my in a way my response to it. So humanism is thinking. That's why I'm not sort of this talk is very unusual for me because I'm an eco-critic and I'm doing jihad here. So this is ever happened to me. So that's why I decided to go back to look at human desire. It's like it is human desire, greed, and the need for competition to win, like Donald Trump. That is causing all the social environmental problems. So that's sort of I'm making a sort of a circle from eco-criticism back to the very humanist sort of interpretation of the COVID-19. So I guess this is in a way answer your question that humanism, humanities studies is still very important, asking the very basic philosophical ideas, and we should look at places that is less obvious. I mean, like religion, how religion can play a role in address COVID-19, rather than saying how technology or more science can help. Yes, they do play a role, but fundamentally it's still the interpersonal issue. Okay, I'll stop there, and perhaps I should just stop and do other people's talk.
I think they really actually hang together quite tightly, all of them. I mean, I remember the first question was about cultural difference, and then another question was like, what do we and I think, like how, is there any kind of distinctive contribution that the humanities can make to understanding what's going on? I think obviously cultural difference is where that comes in, right? I mean, the pandemic is playing out very differently in different places, and that has to do with, of course, it has to do with the material circumstances, but it has to do with human behavior and human culture, right? And of course, what we're studying, that was, I think, Tianguang's question. We're studying metaphors and narratives, and of course, those are the things that shape human behavior. But I think we have to recognize that we cannot study them. That if we want to understand how these metaphors and narratives actually play out in the real world, we have to see that they are how they play out depends on these material questions that I was trying to emphasize, right? Like, we were Professor Howard. Sorry, I forgot your family name. You were talking about the comparison between HIV and COVID, right? Of course, that certain kinds of metaphors stick and others don't. It has to do with the material conditions, or with with the biological property, right? I mean, that HIV was called gay cancer. It was a disease that's much more similar to cancer than to COVID, right? I mean, we can sit next to a cancer patient and not worry about getting sick. And at the beginning, HIV was pretty much incurable, just like cancer, right? So it's, I mean, there's a reason why certain narratives and certain metaphors kind of end up working and others don't. And we have to I think as humanists, it is incumbent, I mean, that's something that I'm kind of convinced of as an environmental humanities person, is that it's incumbent on us to be well informed about these facts, because otherwise our critical thinking machinery ends up producing nonsense, which is of course what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, right? And I think like one thing that humanists can learn from scientists is to be open-ended about, to not prejudge the outcome of what you're looking at, right? And I mean, like that's what I found so like, you know, with Agamben, every word he said, he could have predicted in advance. It was clear what he was going to say. He kind of jumped right out of the gate at the beginning of the thing and kind of did his usual biopolitical modernity as concentration camp routine, and it ended up being making him look like an idiot. And I think that's sort of so. I mean, of course, I didn't mean to say that we shouldn't think critically. I mean, would I if I said that? But I mean, I think when we think we know what it means to think critically, we've already stopped thinking critically, and that's, I think, the problem with a lot of humanists, when they kind of that we kind of too readily assume that what we're doing is critical thinking. And I mean, yeah. So I think the sciences and the humanities are very different. They have different ways of producing knowledge. Both are valuable, but they need to, like, especially with something like COVID, they need to do the dialogue in order to make sense of the dynamic. I don't know. That was already a bit simple.
Thanks for all the questions. And so I think, I was trained as a social scientist, and I'm become more and more drawn to humanities and humanist thinking. So I was reading one study, a lot of the social psychologists that were sort of researching people who believe in conspiracy theory and how it actually made them less compliant to government measures. So there's a lot of sort of public health intervention wanted to critique, right, that people who may have a different kind of belief. But oftentimes the argument is that we have to reserve back to rational thinking, right? So that these people are kind of don't have a good sense of science or whatnot. But really interesting, just looking at that, their own paper itself, they found that those who do not believe in the government information on COVID-19, this is in the UK, they tend to have different kinds of behavior, such as hoarding guns, buying petrol oil, withdrawing cash from the banks, right? So I read those studies as in, yes, conspiracy thinking is really not helpful to a public health crisis, but rational thinking is really not enough, because it can't solve the kind of paranoid drive, right, that we all have as a society. So I think this is where I feel, I think that humanities really plays a big role, right? How do we turn, to create a different kind of culture that embrace paranoia like in a more reparative way. So this is sort of the place that I enter. And I think that to think about how Taiwan, is different from different countries, I feel like Taiwan is really trying to practice this emerging concept of democratic biopolitics, right? So it's not the biopolitics that sort of a government is saying, right, it's the modernity of concentration camp, but it's really a way of, they say, from bottom-up positions such as people are voluntarily complying with mask wearing, the transparent information on disease, the increase of cases, a lot of the community measure and trying to to contain the virus. So this debate, really has started to happen, particularly in the queer public health circle. So in the debates of using PrEP, I don't know if people know, but it's sort of preventive pills of contracting HIV/AIDS. So there's a lot of debates around public health because of the activism, because of humanist theory, that a lot of young scholars now are thinking, when we talk about medicine and medical intervention, we also have to think about sexual subjectivity, right? Or if you think about, earlier, a lot of studies on condom wearing as a public health behavior, it's really not enough just to say it's very dangerous when you don't wear a condom. You actually have to tell them, well, what kinds of power plays in the negotiation process of sexual health, right? So I think both the social scientists and behavioral sciences are really informed by the theories coming from humanities and really pay attention to people's desire, people's feeling, right, people's drive, what would make people actually voluntarily comply. It's not about using information to scare them, but it's really starting from the level of subjectivity. So I think in that way, it's a really great collaboration that we see between science and culture. And just very lastly, I want to say, yes, it's not that we should abandon critical thinking. I think some critical thinking is still very important, particularly the very materialistic one. So I will always say, so sometimes people compare the success of COVID-19 containment is a battle between democracy and authoritarianism. But I think that's a very cold, not helpful thinking. I really think about it as a battle between a country with robust public health system versus a neoliberal countries, right? So we see from the UK and US mostly driven by neoliberal ideology and privatized insurance have really the worst outcome. So I think that kind of left critique and critical thinking is necessary, and it's not that we're being paranoid, it's sort of a political economy that we already know is going to, disaster is going to happen. So I think from that end, a point of historical materialism, critical thinking is still very necessary.
Thank you. Now, Howard, want to respond to the questions or respond to the responses?
Sure. So thank you very much for the questions. I have to apologize for not catching everything, and I'll try to respond to the best of my ability to the questions raised. And if there's insufficiency to my response, please do feel free to reach out or email me with any follow-up questions. And again, I just want to stress that I very much would have liked to be physically there to take your questions, but because of the pandemic, this course needs to be very critical about how I'm going about this. So I want to begin by just suggesting that some of the concepts that have come up in our discussion are truly inspirational, right? So I like this idea of democratic politics. I think I'm still learning from that. I want to go back to the first question raised here. I think it's a good question, right? So in this context where Taiwan actually leads in terms of the public health management of the coronavirus, why are we still talking about foreign experiences? What kind of cross-cultural lessons we can actually draw from, in my case, Wuhan, for example? I think the second part of my talk really builds on this idea that there's a lot to be learned from marginalized perspectives, right? So in a state like Taiwan, where the virus is not as urgent, is not as problematic, we really have more difficulty to understand what HIV patients are going through during the lockdown in Wuhan. So we're really looking from the outside in, but I do think that this point of contrast serves as a valuable lesson to see the questions or the knowledge that we actually don't know or we don't know, and that should probe us to think about how we can address those questions. So I think the advantage of Taiwan allows us to address some of the disadvantages of other places as well. So that's one anchor that I'm going about it. There's a lot of other interesting questions that come up about the compatibility or incompatibility, as the case may be, between critical thinking and the nature of scientific knowledge. And as a historian of science, I must say that this is a question that I kind of try to deal with on a daily basis. A lot of times we have this impression that historians of science are actually quite antagonistic or critical of science or anti-science even. But on the other hand, I think part of what I try to do in the first part of the talk is to suggest that we actually need to take the science at its face value. So, I mean, from the get-go, even before we walk into today's forum, we know that everyone responds to the virus differently, right? Even though there's a large talk about immunology, the immune system, but everyone's immune system is different. So, yes, there is the very basic pathological, virological, and biological knowledge about how the virus works, and I would add that at this point we know much more about how HIV works than how the coronavirus works. But this has a bearing on the social level. This incompatibility, I think, between science and the humanities' critical thinking, critical approaches, fundamentally they might not be all that different. One of the things I tried to address in the first part of the talk is that even within immunological science, there is already a mechanism built in, that system of knowledge, that opens up the possibility for indeterminacy and instability. And I know this is going off to the a little bit. This should not be surprising, right? This comes back to the third question about truth. Okay, not all knowledge claims are claims about truth and falsehood, but scientific claims are about what can be counted as true or false. In this case, if we were to back up a little bit, this whole immunological revolution by the mid-20th century, in which the concept of the self is introduced into immune science, that's a conceptual and epistemological revolution. So the self was not there before the mid-20th century. But that's also not surprising, right? Because even in the 19th century, when there was a whole revolution coming from Darwin and evolutionary biology, that whole revolution had already called into question the very way we understand an organism, right? Darwin tells us some organisms survive and adapt, and other organisms actually become extinct. So this calls into question, what is the organism that serves as a natural coherence of vital entity? So already built into the evolutionary revolution of the 19th century, biological knowledge had a long existing tradition for both synthesis and plurality. And so if we move forward to the contemporary moment and the post-AIDS moment, I mean, one of the things I mentioned in the talk that I love about Donna Haraway's work is that she shows that the potency of these scientific debates, why we as a public are so drawn to these debates, is because the language that's being used there actually has a wider variety, both informs and is informed by larger societal processes. So I think I would kind of end there by saying that at the end of the day, I actually don't think that scientific approaches and critical humanities approaches are that polarizing at the end of the day. There are a lot of similarities in the way that both try to deduce underlying structures of the system that these disciplines are trying to understand. So at the end of the day, right, these processes of system are as constructed as the disciplines at hand. So I just end with a minor footnote. Even though we haven't really talked about this, but a huge motor in critical theory has been the drive to deconstruction. And I want to remind ourselves, again, that deconstruction is about de and then construction. It's not just about destruction.
Okay, thank you. Indeed, I think we are doing very substantial discussion on the issue of science and humanities. These are certainly not separate, divided realms. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, so we'll welcome maybe a couple more questions and then get to responses from the presenters. Yes, please.
My name is Peter Chen from National Taipei University. And first of all, of course, I thank all the presenters for their very inspiring analysis or approaches of the COVID-19. My view is about cross-cultural conflicts, international negotiation, and rhetorical criticism. So my first question will be, COVID-19 if we treat that as a new discipline to study, okay, how can we as scholar or as a professor approach COVID-19? Probably will become a COVID-19ology, okay, it's a newly coined word. But like what Bruce said, just thinking about thinking, I like that the phrase about thinking about thinking. To rhetorical criticism about building up a new term, we should know about facts, values, and the policy. Okay? We don't talk about the persuasive message. Therefore, actually, my first question would go with the professor from National Sports, Professor Lee. Okay, I like that because we must know the facts first. Everything in critical thinking starts from facts, something we don't know. For example, COVID-19, we really don't know where it started, and we don't know when it will end. That makes people scared. Okay, so tell us, if we talk about the facts, then the politics comes. We never know the facts. Okay, when the politician comes. But I just want to say the first question is not only how much we know, but when we know the facts, what will be the possible ensuing conflicts it might arise in this kind of topic. Therefore, facts accompanied by the values and then formed by the policy, I think will be the steps by step in the critical thinking way. The second question will be dealing with the global interdependence. We talk about cross-cultural conflict, we talk about dependence, we talk about independence. Now we have to reshape the definition of interdependence. How we rely on each other as a whole human beings. Scientific approach, humanistic approach, we are together in the sense of interdependence. How could we face this in the perspective of cross-interdependence interpretation? In other words, my second question is that how do we change or move from the critical thinking into another creative thinking? That's useful for my generation, 1950s, I'm sorry, baby boom generation. Whenever we talk about creativity, it's based on the critical approach. But when we talk about critical approach, how can we be possibly positively creative to make people feel not that scared anymore? Because we don't know, actually, COVID-19, where it will lead us to as human beings. So that's my two questions. I hope the presenter can give us more elaboration on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So two questions. One is about the language and rhetoric. The other is about interdependence and how to move from the issue of critical thinking and creative thinking. Okay, let's welcome one more question and then we get to the responses. Yes, Professor Chung.
My name is Hui Zhuzhu. I teach Taiwan literature here. I have a quick question is about the paradox that when we talk about disease or immune system or especially the pandemic, it's very much about the physical contact or all those imagination about the contagions. But now we have arrived at a time that now we are talking about this issue in
thank you. Another very important but also challenging issue to look at this from not only the physical content we have, but also the cyber or the digital environment that we are all in. Okay, responses from the presenters?
Thank you for the questions. I'd like to respond to the first question regarding to how do we reconnect, I guess, and how do we change from critical to creative thinking. I guess we probably were in this post-critical theory era, in the sense that we are not the critical thinking. We are not avoid critical thinking, but we reached the stage where, so what? Okay, after critical thinking, what would be the action? I guess this is a question of where creativity comes from. So I mean, in my presentation, I use the Buddhist model as a way of a remedy of healing the separation between the self and other, and that's the cause of the rivalry and violence. So there are other forms like the arts, there are other forms of bringing together. And I think that the post-humanist theory, like Don Haraway, all those multi-species approaches, that actually going beyond the sort of the separation between inter-human community, but also extended to think of a multi-species society where human, animal, and microbe, even the virus, is actually one entity. So we shouldn't think in terms of separation between this human group and that human group, but rather we should also think in terms of the eco-cosmopolitan, world, in terms of our rigid thinking of dividing human, animal. So that's why we also not only scapegoat other human groups, we also scapegoat animals. Here, the bats or pangolin, and we eat them. Actually, it's going back to the humanism. It's actually the human problem. It's not pangolin's problem, or it's not bats' problem, and it's definitely not the virus problem. It's because of the deforestation and all that's actually created the more frequent contact between human and virus, and that's how it started spreading among human communities. So now it's a question of, creative thinking. Perhaps we should move from a more human-centered community to a more post-humanist one. And that would even do we dare to imagine that virus are us? It is true. Virus are us. Like 80% of our human body actually is composed of microbes. So there are so many ways of moving beyond to think more deconstructively. And the other question about the facts, right? Something about the facts. And I'm going to say something a little bit more controversial. I'm actually very skeptical about the making scene politics. It's a 看见, right? It's all about, it's sort of pretty much one of the major eco-critical sort of slogan, and we have to use science to show the facts. But they are not, it doesn't matter. I mean, facts don't matter in the Trump administration, okay? It's the politics that matter, right? I mean, do you agree with me? We have all the facts, we have all the science to do things, but it's not the science problem, it's not the facts problem. It's the people who are in charge, it's the politicians' problem. So it's going back to the human community's problem. So that's why I keep going back to humanists. It's actually a humanist civilizational crisis. Okay, so thank you.
Question, right? Like this distinction. You said first the facts, then the values, and the policy. And it would be really nice if it was possible to divide them that easily, right? I mean, describing something as something else that we figure out how to evaluate it, right? And that's, of course, the task of the humanities, trying to see how that works. On the other hand, I mean, also maybe you can push back a little bit at Howard. I do think that the way that the scientists produce their facts, it's mostly not about language. I mean, that's the thing that I think is the most striking about it. I mean, it's always when I talk to scientists friends, that like one sentence that always stuck with me. He told me, like, I'm already done with my paper. I just need to read it up now. I need to write it up now. Like, for a humanist person, that's a crazy thing to say. Writing it up is the work, right? For him, the work was did in the laboratory. How he expressed it in words was completely secondary. I mean, it's like so I think it's a very different way of dealing with reality that actually, of course, to some extent involves metaphors and narratives in terms of how it becomes operationalized in society. But it's a fundamentally different way of dealing with reality. And of course, the facts matter. The facts don't matter until they do matter, right? And I think, yeah, so we kind of like working out how exactly this kind of interface works, how that relation, I think that's one of the most important questions that we have to deal with, not just with regard to COVID, but with regard to a whole bunch of other things where the facts unfortunately do matter, even though we kind of choose to ignore them at the moment.
Thank you. Next, very quick, because Yoti says someone else is waiting for the value.
Very quickly, just one very famous social psychological study had talked about the scope of facts. When there's too much fact, in fact, in this broader scope, such as climate change, people actually become numb, right? So there's always the volume, the way of transmitting the fact and knowledge. So all those are playing into the politics of knowing. And very last thing, I think, what's the creative? So for me, as activists as well, I do believe that the creative is happening in movements. So such as the cultural geographer Ruthie Gilmore talks about abolition politics, right? The politics of de-incarceration, like Black Lives Matter, is about making lives. That's where the creative comes from. You have to really starting from, like Howard said, right, from the marginalized perspective. And just very last thing about the wildfire in the West Coast is also connected to the pandemic, right? And there's been indigenous knowledge have been around for decades saying that because the government has banned their knowledge of storing the land once in a while, burning some part of the forest to prevent a large fire, but that practice was actually banned by the government. So now we have the result of total colonial destruction that we see in the West Coast, right? So really learning from the marginalized, where the knowledge comes from, not marginalized people's perspective. I think that's really where the creative comes from.
Okay, thank you. Howard, you want to make a last but quick ending of the responses?
Yeah, so I just have a very quick comment in response. I really like this idea of interdependence and how it relates to when you think about critical thinking. I think what is interesting is that we know COVID-19 is a virus. We know that the virus has a whole brain, right? But it's playing such a role in shaping human evolution. So in the sense that we as humans are actually not just talking about the virus, also talking about its effect on it and how we react to it. So this actually suggests that there is probably a more codependent or interdependent conceptualization of the relationship between humans and the non-human world. But the virus, on a very biological level, it can have a very negative consequence on human bodies. But in the larger scheme of things, it does serve as an important change the course of the species. So this is very I think for that critical theory asked the question, has to teach from out of steam. And I think today is a testament to how that is not the case.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Of course, COVID-19 is not only a scientific crisis, it's a humanistic crisis. And will contribute by pointing out all the fundamental philosophical aspects of it. And we'll continue being the critical thinkers and creative thinkers. To end the session, please join me to thank our presenters and also the wonderful questions from the audience. We'll meet again next time in the discussion. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
So we are going to have a group photo together. So please stay and we'll see you. Okay? And we invite our speakers to come and make it.
Yes, but they provide the information, the facts, but we have to. I even told my friend Scott Slovik, like, what am I doing?
So we're going to have a group photo, so are you ready?
I count 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Oh, one more. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, thank you for your participation.